It's good to be back. I'm back from Don just referred to it as a 7-week vacation, and that felt hurtful. I like to use the word sabbatical just because it sounds more spiritual. So, but seriously, our elders kind of gifted my family a 7-week sabbatical, and so we were able to step away and just take some time to recharge. Maybe you didn't even notice I was gone, so surprise, I was. Maybe I actually met some people today that have started coming here while I've been gone, and they were like, "Who are you?" And so I had to kind of puff my chest out and say, I used to work here, and no one remembers me. So anyway, it's good to be back. My name is Mark, and I'm the lead pastor here again. All right, so that's the story. But it was good to get away this summer and just practice Sabbath and practice sabbatical. I did some reading and some different things I learned. It said Sabbath is not a reward for hard work. Sabbath is a reminder that our work will remain incomplete. And Sabbath moves us from production to presence. Sabbath reminds us that we are not God. And Sabbath points us to the deeper rest we need in Jesus. And for all those reasons and many more, it was a great Sabbath. It was good to just get away and recharge and kind of remind myself who I am in Christ. And so we got to spend some time as a family, got to spend some time with my brothers, with my parents, got to do some reading and just study and lots of fun things. And so I wanted to actually kind of show you one of the things we did. We went on a 4-week cross-country trip. And this was something that I've always wanted to do, and so I just wanted to show this to you. This is our path that we made across America. I had some friends that were like, "You're crazy. This is the last thing I'd want to do on sabbatical," but this was my dream. Always wanted to do this. Always wanted to go to a bunch of the national parks and wanted to make sure that my kids were old enough to remember it because I was paying for it, so they need to remember it, right? And so we got to trace that, and so we went to all kinds of different places. Got to go. I think there's a picture there of us, Yosemite, and there's one of us in front of a redwood. There's ones of us on the coast up in California in Portland, and we took a picture in we keep Portland weird because that's what you're supposed to do when you're in Portland, I think. And so we did all this stuff. Went to Seattle, and then I think the final one there is Mount Rushmore. I don't know what I would have done if I didn't have 4 kids, but I've been planning that picture for like a year. They didn't know it. But I was like, I need you to stand like this and you to stand like this. And they were like, okay, they weren't really fans of it, but they humored me. So that's the trip. Thank you so much for those that stepped up while we were gone and did things. Thanks to our elders and to the church as a whole. Just really refreshing and good. I'm excited for this next season as a church and feeling rested. So enough about that, enough about me. We start a new series today. Don actually referred to it as Adventures in Babysitting, and you may feel that that's what it is as a parent sometimes, but we're actually calling it Adventures in Parenting. So again, we're going to choose the more spiritual word and try to make it sound mature. But we want to talk about parenting. Most of you know parenting often begins with childbirth and then moves on into potty training and goes from there into discipline and goes through a lot of different stages into peer pressure and dating and picking a college and deciding what you want to do for the rest of your life. And some of you are like, oh yeah, that's why I don't have kids. Just as he talks about it, it's making me stressed out thinking about it. But that's the magic of parenting. That's what we want to talk about in this series. Parenting is something that God has allowed many of us to do, something that he's called us to, something that he's asked us to do as we disciple and look over an eternal soul that he's gifted us to. But this series isn't just for parents. I think that would be an obvious thing that there's going to be many parenting takeaways. But I think anytime we talk about God and we talk about his perspective and his love for us as a father, we can be reminded of how he views us, how he looks at us, and how our relationship with him can be. And so my hope isn't just that the people who just had kids and are like dying for this will be paying attention and everyone else is like, oh, this doesn't apply to me. The goal is that this applies to all of us and to our relationship with our Heavenly Father. And so we want to dig in. Week 1, Adventures in Parenting. So let's kick us off here. I want to just give a few foundational verses. These are some things that seem to be very, very clear in the Bible. There's basically 3 kinds of verses in the Bible about parenting. Here's one maybe you've heard, maybe your grandma has this in her house on a sign somewhere, but it's Proverbs 22:6. It says, direct your children onto the right path, and when they are older, they will not leave it. All right, so we know that the job description of a parent is that we are supposed to point our kids to Jesus. So we're supposed to direct them in the way of what it looks like to have a relationship with God and to follow him. That's one kind of verse that the Bible often says about parenting. Here's another one. Isaiah 54:13. I will teach all your children, and they will enjoy great peace. The job of a parent is not just to point them to a relationship with God, but to remind them that nothing else will give them peace. I often want to tell my kids that they have to cheer for certain teams and like certain bands and act a certain way, but the reality is, if they do all of the things that I want them to do, if they follow me, they try to be like me, that will not give them peace in their life. Peace comes from one person and one relationship, and that's from knowing God. And so we're supposed to point our kids onto the right path of walking with God, and we need to let them know that they need to walk with him and have a relationship with him to know peace. And then here's the third kind of verse that the Bible often tells parents. Colossians 3:21. Fathers, do not aggravate your children, or they will become discouraged. Yeah, that's kind of a downer, isn't it? Those first two were a lot more rah-rah. That's how this seems to go, and it's not just Colossians. There's one of those in Ephesians. There's a couple of them, right? Because it's possible to do this parenting thing wrong. And God seems to be aware of that he's asked imperfect people to raise other imperfect people, and sometimes there's going to be feuds, sometimes there's going to be aggravation. It's possible to do this parenting thing wrong. And so this passage doesn't say, hey, try to make your kids happy or try to keep them from being too screwed up. It's saying, no, there's a way to do this wrong, and make sure that you don't turn your kids against you. Make sure that you don't turn them against God as you raise them. You might have good intentions, but if you put too much pressure on them, your kids could be embittered toward you or toward God or toward the church or all those things. So a good parent shows their children what it's like to walk with Jesus. A good parent connects their kids to Jesus so that they can know peace. And a good parent does not embitter their children as they parent them. Anybody feeling stressed out yet? Just me? Okay. I just lived in a minivan with my kids for 4 weeks, so I don't even have to tell you how many of those rules I broke or what that looked like, but parenting is a very intense job, and parenting is something that we can mess up. So how do we do those foundational things? How do we point our kids to Jesus? How do we give them peace? How do we make sure that we're not embittering them or going too far as a mother, as a father? Those are the questions, and that's what we want to get to today. And so if you have a Bible here with you, we're going to be in the book of Deuteronomy. We're going to start in chapter 4. We're going to go to chapter 6. If you've got one of the ones that's under your seat there, we're going to be on page 142, the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4. If you don't have a copy of God's Word, you don't have a Bible, or if you like the way that one sounds and reads, that is our gift to you. Feel free to take that home with you this week. We would love for you to be able to read that and spend more time in it, but we're going to be in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 9 on page 142, and we want to see what this passage has for us this evening. These passages that we're going to look at, God is talking through Moses, and he's passing on this message to the nation of Israel. God had brought this nation of Israel, his people, his nation. He had a covenant relationship with them. He brought them out of slavery. He took them to the promised land that he said he would give them, and he was walking with them. And so he's kind of setting down some boundaries, some ground rules, and he's saying, you have a relationship with me, you're walking with me. Here's what it's going to look like to do that now, and in the next generation, and in the next generation, and in the next generation. And so these passages are kind of in that heart of discipleship, that heart of parenting, and that heart of passing on faith, as we talked about as the baseline for a parent. So here's what Deuteronomy 4, verse 9 says, page 142, if you've got one of those Bibles. It says this, but watch out. Be careful never to forget what you yourself have seen. Do not let these memories escape from your mind as long as you live, and be sure to pass them on to your children and grandchildren. Never forget the day when you stood before the Lord your God at Mount Sinai, where he told me, summon the people before me, and I will personally instruct them. Then they will learn to fear me as long as they live, and they will teach their children to fear me also. The nation of Israel has been through an incredible journey. For generations, they've seen God move and work and bring them out of slavery and do these incredible things and save them as a nation. And so God is reminding them in this moment, he's saying, hey, don't forget about what happened. Don't forget about your past. Don't forget about what I've done. Seems like a no-brainer, but people often forget. God is saying, hey, that story that happened, that story that you've been a part of, that great thing that I did, make sure that echoes forward. When you're hanging out with the kids, talk about that. Someday when you're passing on things to your grandkids, talk about that. Remind them of what I've done so that people do not forget. And that's true now. I know some of us maybe weren't the best people in college, and we try not to talk about that at church. And so we don't really want to talk about those years from like 16 to 24. We don't ever want our kids to know any of the things that we did. And yet God is saying, listen, I've been part of your life. I've been part of your story. I've provided for you. I've done things. Make sure that people know. He doesn't say, hey, Israel, you've been perfect. You have a great track record. Go ahead and tell that story. No, anyone that knows the Old Testament knows that the nation of Israel was not perfect. We often refer to it as the spiritual merry-go-round, right? Israel would walk with God and things would go great, and then they would turn their back on him and things would go terrible. And then they'd cry out and say, God, save us. And he would swoop in and save them and things would go great and their army would win a battle. And then they'd start worshiping other gods and things would go bad, and up and down and up and down and up and down the spiritual merry-go-round of Israel. And so they're not perfect. They're not these people that can say, hey, we've been awesome. Let's pass this on to our kids. No, they've got some embarrassing things in their past. But this isn't about them. And as we invest in the lives of our kids and our grandkids and nieces and nephews and people that we get to have influence over, it's not about us. Here's what you can know in your imperfect story. Your story points people to God. Your story's not gonna sing your praises and say that you're perfect, and that's okay, because you're not perfect, and I'm not either. We want our story to point people to God. We want our story to remind people of what God has done in our lives, his presence, his love, his investment, and that is what we're being reminded to do here. We're being told to pass on our story, to talk about what God has done. I hear people often say that being a kid today is tough. I guess there's some new things, you know. The internet's kind of changing things, but a lot of the things are the same. And so parents, I want to remind you, you've been through most of the core issues that your kids are going to go through. You remember the first time that you were embarrassed. You remember the first time that you fell in love. You remember what it's like to get cut from a team. You remember getting your first job. You remember peer pressure. You remember when your voice cracked in front of that girl. You remember the ways that God has been with you at every age and every stage of your life, and you can now look back and say, God was with me. God was walking with me. God was faithful. God kept his promise. Even when I turned my back on God, he was with me. And you can sing that to your kids. You know how God was walking with you through different stages of your life. You know how God got your attention. You know how God has provided. And you know that when you turn your attention to him, he was right there waiting. Here's our big idea for this evening. It's this. Teach your kids in the present how God was faithful in the past so they can trust him in the future. And we see that unfolding in the story of Israel. Sometimes they would sort of pass on what happened, and they would sort of remind their kids and the future generations and present generations what God had done, and sometimes they would just forget. And we would see their entire nation faceplant. And so God was very clear with them in this passage. He said, do not forget what I've done and pass it on. We like to play devil's advocate to ourselves, and we like to think, well, there's people that could say it more eloquently. Nope. No one can tell your story better than you can tell your story. And no one wants to hear your story more than your kids. And no one can point to God's faithfulness in your life better than you. And no one can point out God's provision in your life better than you. And no one can say how God has redeemed your story better than you. So pass on your story. Tell future generations what God has done. Teach your kids in the present how God was faithful in the past so they can trust him in the future. Let's move on to Deuteronomy 6. Just flip over there, a couple pages, maybe a couple chapters Deuteronomy 6, verse 1, again in this same vein where God is reminding Israel, I've been with you, I'm walking with you, I've been part of your story, I love you, I'm in a covenant relationship with you, and here are some things that I think you're going to want to know as you pass this story and this faith on to future generations. Deuteronomy 6, verse 1 says this, these are the commands, decrees, and regulations that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you. You must obey them in the land you're about to enter and occupy, and you and your children and grandchildren must fear the Lord your God as long as you live. If you obey all his decrees and commands, you will enjoy a long life. Listen closely, Israel. Be careful to obey. Then all will go well with you, and you will have many children in the land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, promised you. Verse 4, listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all of your strength. And you must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these commands that I am giving you today. Repeat them again and again to your children. Talk about them when you are at home and when you are on the road, when you are going to bed and when you are getting up. Tie them to your hands and wear them on your forehead as reminders. Write them on your doorposts of your house and on your gates. Both of these passages have pretty clearly said that God is reminding us, listen, I have redeemed your story. I've been a part of your story. I've sent my son so that you could know me. We're in a relationship, and I want you to pass that story on. God is saying, keep your eyes on me and pass your faith along. He reminds Israel to love him with their heart, with their soul, with their mind, and that sounds really good, right? In fact, that big idea I gave you sounded pretty good too, right? Just rolls off the tongue. You could put it on a bumper sticker, a t-shirt, and say, this is how parenting happens. And yet sometimes when we hear something like, pass on your story, remind your kids about your faith, it's like, yeah, but that's intimidating, or I don't know how to do that. Or maybe if we're being honest, some of us would say, listen, Mark, my parents didn't do that. I was taught a lot of unhealthy things. A lot of things that I do my best not to repeat now, but I didn't have good parents. And so I don't know how to pass on faith. My parents didn't have a relationship with God. My parents didn't have a relationship with Jesus. They knew nothing. We never went to church. They didn't own a Bible, and I don't know how to do this. It certainly does not come naturally to me. And so I love that this passage from chapter 6 kind of dials down and tells us exactly what does it look like to pass on our faith to future generations. What does it look like to say, God has been so good to us and you can walk with him? Verse 7 tells us that parenting is about consistency and repetition. If you're a note taker, you can write that down. We'll put it up here on the screen, but verse 7 kind of says that. It says, repeat them again and again to your children. Talk about them when you're at home and when you're on the road, right? Parenting is about consistency and repetition. You can't tell your kids one time, hey, God's really good, you should pray to him or something, and just expect them to remember it. Just like you can't tell them one time to put the toilet seat down, right? You can't tell them one time, stop leaving the door open, were you born in a barn? Some of those classic phrases that we love to say as parents, right? We know that we have to repeat other things, and yet when it comes to passing along our faith, we think like, well, I told them once. They know that I like God and stuff. We prayed at that one cookout. I'm sure they'll catch on. I'm sure they'll get it. No, passing our faith on and forming future generations is about consistency and repetition. And so they need to hear you saying these things and speaking these things often. When you're part of an athletic team, you don't just practice once and then say, all right, it's going to be a great season. No, you do something over and over and over and over and over again, and you hope that it'll be a good season. And so parenting should be the same way. If we're called to disciple a life, we're called to build faith in the next generation, we have to repeat ourselves and repeat what God is doing in our lives and repeat what God has put in our hearts and repeat our story and pass that on. And we have to be consistent because your kids are watching your life and they're watching your conduct and they're watching how you act. You can't just say something one moment and then not really mean it or not really back it up the next. They're watching when you're a hypocrite, and they're watching when you don't mean what you say, and they're watching when you don't back up the things that you've said. They're watching. So Moses is passing along God's message to Israel, and he's saying, listen, if you're going to pass on your faith, you're going to have to be consistent, and you're going to have to repeat these things often. That's what parenting looks like. So does your life consistently point to a life that's surrendered to Jesus? Does your life tell your kids that you're dependent on him? Do your kids see someone who lives for the approval of God? Or do they see someone who lives for the approval of others? Do your kids see someone who loves their job? Or do they see someone who does their job because of their love for God? Is the message of your life the message of Jesus? And does your life and your actions and your conduct repeat that message over and over and over to the people in your home? Parenting is about consistency and repetition. Another thing that's in the second part of verse 7 there, it says that not only should you repeat these truths again and again and again, but it says when you're on the road, when you're at home, when you're going to bed, and when you're getting up. Here's a second thing you can write down. Parenting is done every hour of your day. And some of you were like, yeah, duh. How many kids did you have to figure that out, Mark? 4, to be clear. I had to have my 4th kid to figure that out. No, I'm just joking. But sometimes we just have to know the job description. Sometimes we have to know that the goal is not just to make sure our kids are alive at the end of the day, or that most of them got fed, or they all got to the places they need to go, and they're ready for bed, and some of them even brush their teeth. That's not our only goal. We should be passing on our faith every hour of every day. Some of you were like, yeah, that doesn't really fit my job, because I do fill in the blank thing. Well, guess what? I don't want to sound unspiritual, but most of your kids are probably not going to be missionaries to another country, all right? Most of our kids, most of your kids are going to work a job, and they're going to have to know what it looks like to live for Jesus every day, every hour in that job. So the best way that you can show them that is to live it now. Let them see a 24/7 faith in you. And let them see that that's every part of your day, every hour of your day. Let them see that you're honoring Jesus in the way that you get ready in the morning, in the way that you're making breakfast. Let them see that when you're driving them to soccer, you're doing that as worship. Let them see when you're cutting down trees that your life is different, hopefully. Let them see when you're going on vacation that you want to walk with God and you want to honor and glorify him. Tell your kids about Jesus when you're praying before dinner. And tell your kids about Jesus when you're praying with them before you tuck them in at night. Let them see that there's not a part of your life that doesn't have Jesus. There's not a remnant of your life where you're like, faith doesn't really fit in that part, but when I'm home, I'm a good, warm Christian. Let them see that your faith that you want to pass on that's very real is there in the morning, the afternoon, the evening, every hour of your day. Parenting is done every hour of your day. Verses 8 and 9 maybe don't sound too normal to us, but it says, as it talks about passing on faith, tie them to your hands and wear them on your forehead as reminders. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. It's talking about Bible verses. It's talking about the truth and the faith that we have the opportunity to pass on. Parenting is modeling every area of your life. I mentioned that most of our kids are probably not going to be missionaries that go to other countries, and so we get to show our kids what does it look like to be a teacher who loves Jesus and lives on mission? What does it look like to be a nurse who loves Jesus and lives on mission? What does it look like to be someone who's getting their master's or their doctorate and loves Jesus and lives on mission? What does it look like to be in sales? What does it look like to be in finance? What does it look like to stay home with our kids and love Jesus? What does it look like to be a lawyer? What does it look like to do any of the jobs that we can make up in this room? What does it look like for us to honor God where we are with all that we are? When Jesus said to the disciples, "Follow me," he didn't say, "Hey guys, come with me and I'm gonna buy you these really cool workbooks, and 1 hour out of the week we're gonna get together and we're gonna fill them out, we're gonna fill in the blanks, and then you'll be my disciples." No, he literally just said, "Follow me." And so whatever Jesus was doing, his disciples are saying like, "Okay, that's how you live for God, making fish on the beach. And this is how you live for God, walking from one village to the next." I'm sure they saw him interact with his siblings and with his mom. They saw every aspect of his life. And he said, "Follow me." And he passed on what faith looked like in his day-to-day life. That's what we're called to do. That's what we get to do. Parenting is modeling every area of your life, even the ones that we're not doing so great at. Sometimes we model things that we wouldn't want to model, and that is where parenting stresses us out. But our kids are watching, and the people that we get to disciple are watching. And so we need to be conscious. Are we passing on our faith? Are we walking with Jesus? Are we living for Jesus in every area of our life? Teach your kids in the present how God was faithful in the past so they can trust him in the future. Parenting is about consistency and repetition. Parenting is done every hour of your day, and parenting is modeling every area of your life. There's a verse in Psalm 127 that says that children are a blessing from the Lord. And as I read those statements, I want to say, no, they're not. They're just putting a lot of pressure on parents. Now we have to pass on this faith, and if we don't do everything right every hour of every day, we're the ones that are screwing our kids up. And there is a certain pressure to parenting. There is a certain pressure to having people look at your life and your conduct and having people know what you're doing. But I think what gives me hope as I look at these passages is knowing that everything that we're expected to live, everything that we're expected to do, everything that we're expected to represent, Jesus has already invested into us. See, we're not called to be perfect parents just because it comes naturally or because we know how to do this. No, left to ourselves, most of us we're not too impressive. Most of us are a letdown, and most of us would not raise kids that we could be proud of. It's because we're sinners and we have a natural sin nature. We think that we know better than God and we mess up. We're separated from God. We're lost in our own sin. We're lost in our own lives. And yet Jesus came to this world and said, "I don't want you to be separated from God. I don't want you to be far from him." And he gave his life so that we could know Jesus, so that we could have relationship with Jesus, and so that we could live for him. And by surrendering our life, surrendering our will, we can walk with Jesus and we can be made new. And a life surrendered to Jesus is a difference maker. A life surrendered to Jesus is one that he can build on. And so a parent's life surrendered to Jesus is one that's starting to go in the right direction. Because Jesus is consistent and repetitive in our lives. His love, his presence, his affirmation, and what he pours out on us is consistent in our lives. His love is every hour of every day. And his love is available and visible in every area of our lives. And so all the things that we're called to be, all the things that we're called to do as parents, we've already had them modeled through the life and the presence and through a relationship with Jesus. And so we're not asked to do something that's mysterious to us or something that we have no idea how to do. We're being called to echo Jesus and reflect Jesus in the lives that we get to impact. But to do that, we have to be surrendered to him. And we have to believe that his ways are best. And we have to believe that walking with him really is a better option than anything that we can come up with. And let's be honest, we don't always think that, right? We think, well, I'm gonna do what my coach told me back when I was in 8th grade. That'll be good for this moment. And it's like, is that Christ-like? No, but I remember it in my life. I'm gonna do what my dad told me. I'm gonna do whatever my anger wants me to do in this moment. And we don't surrender ourselves as influencers, as disciplers, as parents. When we're following the example and the life and the presence of Jesus in our lives, we're able to let God work through us in the lives that we impact and the lives that we get to disciple. Parenting is nothing more than a form of discipleship. It's intimidating, it's stressful, it gets us worked up, but parenting is simply discipleship. As we walk after God, as we walk with God, we get to have people follow us and mimic the things that we're doing in our lives. So I hope whether you're a parent, whether you're getting ready to be a parent, whether you hope to be a parent, or whether you maybe you're in a spot where you say, I don't know if I'll ever be a parent, I hope that you can be reminded that our job is to walk with Jesus, walk after Jesus, and model that for other people. This isn't about us. We don't have to be anything. We don't have to be perfect. We just have to walk with Jesus and walk after Jesus so that the people that are coming behind us, the generations that are behind us, can look at them and say, I'm gonna do that. I wanna do that. When I look at that life, I see God's faithfulness, I see God's love, and I want to know that same God, and I want to know those same things. We don't have to complicate parenting. We just have to know that our job is to reflect God to future generations. I had a mentor tell me one time, he said, in your life as a pastor, you will have more people ask you about your marriage and about parenting than you ever will a relationship with God. And he was right. It's not often that I'm just in the park and someone says, hey, you're a pastor, right? How can I surrender my life to Jesus? But sometimes people will interact with my family and they'll say something like, hey, how do you do this with your kids? I notice that your kids aren't constantly punching each other all the time. Why is that? Hey, you and your wife seem to like each other. What's going on? One of the tools that God has given us as his church and as his people is that our marriages and our families and our kids are a light to the world. Because sometimes people can ignore certain things about our lives, but they cannot ignore a marriage that works. And they cannot ignore a family that loves each other. And they cannot ignore when we're walking with God and our kids are following us and walking with God also. That is a light to the world that can't be ignored. So know that your parenting matters, know that your discipleship matters, know that your impact matters, and the way that you interact with your kids and your grandkids and the faith that you're passing on matters. Because the world is looking and the world will ask you, hey, what's different about your marriage? What's different about your parenting? What's different about your family? Because it doesn't look like mine. And that's when you get to pass on your faith. That's when you get to say, let me tell you about what God has done in the past. Let me tell you about that right now. And let me tell you what God can do for you in the future. Let's pray together. God, thank you so much, Lord, that when we are lost, you come and find us. You send your son Jesus so that we can have relationship with you and know you. God, thank you that we can be found and we can have life, we can have peace, we can be in your presence. Lord, parenting is a tough job. Being a disciple maker is a tough job. Having influence, having people look to us, having people follow us, Lord, it's not just parenting, it's the roles that we fulfill at work, it's the people that are looking up to us, the friends that we have. Lord, help us to be people that our lives look different, Lord, because we're following you, because we're walking with you, and Lord, because we're continuously and repetitively singing your praises. God, help us to be consistent. Help us to walk with you every hour of every day and in every area of our lives so that our past can echo into the future. God, help us to live our faith for our families, for our kids, for those who are watching us. and for those that we get to impact. Lord, help us to be a church that lives our faith so that we can point people to you and glorify your name. It's in the name of Jesus I pray. Amen.